All right. So now with the corgi painting, I've only done one layer, and that was my base paint, right, at 100% opacity with my fancy brush. So now let's talk about blended paint. Now this time, I'm going to go ahead and use a lower opacity. This time I'm going to keep the opacity probably between 30 and 50. I'll start on the high end, so maybe at 50. And the brush I'm going to use, let me look at my brushes. Where is my brush? Huh. So I'm going to use just a simple brush that goes thick to thin, right? It has a lot of texture to it. But remember that any brush can be modified. So this is what the brush looks like, right? And then I can use brush settings, and especially playing with shape dynamics, to play with the angles, the roundness, the texture. There we go. But I want something pretty responsive as well. Okay, now because I've set up the file with my references off to the side in separate Photoshop files, that allows me to steal colors just like I would if I'm an oil painter and I have a palette off to the side. So I'm just going to use the brush. I'm going to keep it at about 100 pixels because it is pressure sensitive for size. So I can go smaller than that. And then I can just steal colors directly and start painting them in. And you'll see that it starts blending with the texture of the brush in a very different way. And at first, I'm just going to try to get a lot of color in there, working around the darkest darks, just putting some blues in there, not zooming in too much. Feel like I need some more oranges. And it's not about the intensity of your color, it's about which colors are next to which colors. Sometimes grays can feel incredibly dynamic when they're surrounded by the right color theory. And remember, I'm only working at an opacity of about 50%. I forgot to set that for the brush. So that helps me blend it in. But you can always shift that opacity as you need to. I'm going for a little bit more subtlety now. Now, why do I separate it out? So I have the 100% opaque layer, and then I have the blended paint. Well, there's lots of tricks you can do, and lots of options you have in digital painting if you do separate it out onto different layers, especially like foreground, background layers, things like that. I'm just going to do a little bit more of this big stuff, and then I'll be able to kind of zoom in and work on different aspects. So what we need to do kind of early on today is establish what level of finish we want for this project. And I'm working on two of them, right? I'm working on animal and a person. You're just picking one. But you have to figure out what's the level of finish. When does it look good? And then how can I have enough time with that chosen level of finish to bring that level everywhere, so it doesn't feel incomplete. And remember, we're not doing backgrounds. This is just our introduction to digital painting. Bless you. Yeah, now that orange is beginning to sing. It's surrounded by the right color theory. A little bit of that light blue in there. Now it's really starting to feel like paint is building up. And the type of paint is really defined by the brush you choose, or the brush you make. Now, some of you made brushes last class and then wanted to use them at home. The way you do that is you simply go to your brushes, you select the one you want, then you go to the brush window options and you say export selected brushes. So if you really like it, you can export it, and I'm going to call this a pastel brush. Export, save it to the desktop. It creates what's called an ABR file. That ABR file can be loaded into any version of Photoshop. You just go to your brush window options and you say load, or import rather, brush. Then I can bring it in and it will add it to my brush options. So I want lots of color everywhere. My Photoshop program is working pretty well for me right now, allowing me to layer these things up. But also direction matters. Even with these really simple $60 tablets, these bamboo tablets, the direction that you kind of work from, the arcs you use, should describe the form, because that does a lot of your work for you. Now, this is also where the navigator is really helpful. I can see what all that blended paint does to help solidify it. So that's all I've done so far. But those little blended marks do a lot to add to a level of finish. Okay. So now if I zoom in, I can use the navigator. I can zoom in on the face, right? And you can see how chunky that brush is. And then I can also zoom in on my reference here on the face. I might even need to do something like a levels adjustment just on the photo reference so I can see those eyes more clearly. Something like that. And now I can make my brush just a little bit smaller. The one thing with custom brushes is you won't get the hardness setting. So you have to build your brush with a slightly soft edge. I'm going to actually go to the higher opacity, between 70 and 50%. And now I can see that there's some blue in the eyes. And I'm going to try to figure out my level of finish. I might even have to go a little bit smaller. And I'm going to take that brush setting. There's a lot of texture in there. I'm going to turn that off for the moment, just so I can paint. Or let's make it a lot less. And let's make sure those shape dynamics are pretty strong. Take that minimum diameter down. There we go. So now I'll be able to really kind of shape it quickly, though it won't look as gestural. Right? So it's pretty high stakes to just start with the eye. So maybe I'll start with the nose here, building it up at about a 70% opacity, painting it in. All this rougher painting I did, if it was oil painting, that's called scumbling. And you try to keep your energy up even though you're kind of fleshing out some details here. And if you do this long enough and kind of observe it correctly, that's how you get to photorealism eventually. But there aren't really any great shortcuts to that. It's just lots of blending, lots of layering. But you can see how that strong texture to the brushes I was using. This is the same brush with just a lower texture setting. Really does make it look like paint. Sounds like someone painted on the wrong layer for a while. Happens. Now use your creative kind of compositing skills and your problem solving to figure out how can you not have to just repaint all of that. How can you duplicate and move that? Yeah, but some painter at one point said, I heard this in school at some point, that painting is repainting. It's like the phrase, writing is editing, right? So it's not the worst thing to have to do things again. It's how we learn. Of course, it is the worst thing for deadlines. That's why there's a high suicide rate in art. It's very stressful. That's good. You guys, you got to love yourself. It's important. Even though none of us deserve it. I've been talking about Nietzsche with people lately, so talking about utopian philosophies and art history. It's kind of dark. So, all right, so you can see how that eye, that's kind of given me a level of finish that I'm going for, right? Huge difference with the blended layer, built up pretty quickly, just observing with the right size of brush. So now I don't want to get any more detailed than that until I've brought that level of kind of color diversity and a textural engagement and interest to all the other parts of the painting. So I can kind of build away from the eye, I can build into the nose. I'm stealing colors mostly from myself, but every once in a while from the Wayne Thiebaud or from other color inspirations I might have. Remember, animals are more forgiving than people, so I don't need to worry quite so much about getting the facial anatomy of this dog correct. But if it's for a client and it's a pet portrait, you know, beware. Make sure it looks like that pet. And be wary of doing commissions of portraits for people of their family members, because they get really picky. Even when you're doing it for free, they will pick apart. And honestly, maybe their family members just aren't that attractive, right? So you have to make them attractive. It's the artist's job. We talk about real world issues here. There are indeed.